Hey everybody, it's Peter again with Wargaming with Peter. The Dawn Patrol podcast, I guess if you want to call it that. It's kind of a loosely used term there. I have a special guest today, Ian Brown, of the USMC, retired major. Correct me if I'm incorrect on that, Ian. But let's start maybe with a little background of where you come from, why wargaming is important to you, and then we'll kind of set the tone for the agenda here after that.
Yeah, sure. Well, Peter, first of all, happy to be a guest here and talk about wargaming. It's definitely one of my personal and professional passions. As you said, I'm retired from the Marine Corps. Um, after the 20 years in, I was a Stage 53 helicopter pilot, but I did some time on the ground as a forward air controller with 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, as well as some time as a requirements officer. But my last 4 years in the Marine Corps were kind of where the wargaming piece and sort of the subject of what we're going to get to today comes in, because I spent 4 years at the Brew Kulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare at Marine Corps University, a think tank type organization, sort of how that was the bumper sticker we put on ourselves. But the purpose of the Kulak Center was to inject innovative and creative thought opportunities to students across all of the different schools at Marine Corps University in Quantico. And one of the ways of doing that was wargaming. And so when I got there, summer of 2019, they'd been around for a year and they were already doing some sort of smaller scale wargaming where they could, to just sort of demonstrate it as a tool for the students, supporting some of the other instructors who were also using it in their courses. But shortly after I got there is when one General David Berger took over as commandant on the Marine Corps. And then shortly after, two, he published his initial planning guidance, which had wargaming all over it. It was, as any, when the new commandant, when he publishes his guidance, as good Marines should, you read it and you sort of look at the things that you think are applicable to where you're at. And it was clear he considered wargaming a vital tool and something that needed serious investment. And so from about late 2019 onward through the rest of my time there, through last summer when I retired, we tried to help Marine Corps University, stand up a more robust educational wargaming ability in both the digital world, but also sort of your classic tabletop type games, again, across the schools, and also branching out where we could sometimes to the distance education programs, and linking up with other educational organizations that were doing wargaming, both U.S. military, allied partner militaries, and periodically civilian institutions. And so when I left in summer 2023, we had grown a lot, and but it grown a lot, but there was still a lot of work to be done. Really, I kind of knew the work was really only beginning. And so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a very good segue, if you will, into what kind of had spurred my kind of interest in the topic was one of your LinkedIn posts recently, which I have highlighted here, which we'll kind of break down a little bit here in a moment. But and then you can speak to this, of course. But your post was, of course, in reaction to or in support of Damien O'Connell's article on the Maneuverist website.
Yeah.
On the progress and perils educational wargaming in the U.S. Marine Corps. Do you know Damien's background? I just for the sake of the audience, I don't know it directly, but
yeah, no, I do. I've known him. I'm trying to think. I've known for several years. I'm kind of blanking on this. The start point might have been when actually the last time I was in Quantico, when I was a requirements officer from 2013 to 2016. I think that's where our paths first overlapped, because he had been doing work with the case method project at MCU. I started going to some of the like the decision for some case lunchtime brown bags that Dr. Bruce Goodmanson there sort of did, and I thought it was fun. I got interested in that, but that was also the time I was starting to do deeper archival work on my master's degree, which would later translate into a book manuscript. But the point is, I was going over to MCU sort of fairly regularly. And our paths first crossed there, as we, you see the title of his webpage, The Maneuverist. I was researching maneuver warfare. He was, interested in the background and application of maneuver warfare to Marines today. And we stayed in touch, and he stood up the Warfighting Society, sort of informal professional development organization. I've supported that, kind of as I've been able throughout, when I sort of find the time. But yeah, so I've known Damien for a long time. He's always had a very passionate interest in professional development of military officers, especially Marines. And he's also developed his own network. And as you see in some of the people who he cites and talk to, he knows a lot of the people out there in the fleet around the Marine Corps who are trying to do this in their own spaces.
And without getting too deep into it, I think that's somewhat from my vantage point, and just so I'm clear with everybody, I'm non-ex-mil, not active or reservist at all. I just have a weird interest in all this, so a strange interest in proliferation of wargaming throughout the world. But the one thing that stuck out in his article, I think maybe as a central point, was that it fundamentally is going in the right direction, right? It's not taking off as expected based on maybe the predominance of the message about wargaming in the 38th Commandant's planning guide, which we'll take a look at here in a moment as well. Let's set a baseline here. I mean, where do you see wargaming at as far as a state, if you will, and what do you see as better and best end states, right? Would you say we are in a good state at this point and we need to get better? I mean, what does better look like, and what does even best look like if we ever actually get there?
Yeah, what does better and best look like is really the key question. But to sort of the state, it's certainly heads and shoulders above where it was when I started at the Krulak Center in 2019. Because and I'm gonna sort of pull in some information here, because from a different article that I did with Sebastian Bay, who he's cited in that piece by Damien several times. But it was what was it? I want to say it was summer. Yeah, it was 2021. Sebastian and I co-authored a piece in Marine Corps University's Journal of Advanced Military Studies, where we looked. It was sort of we wanted the history of Marine Corps wargaming, because 2019, 2020, with Commandant's Planning Guidance, Force Design 2030, and General Berger's clear guidance on it, we kind of wanted to trace the thread back to, well, hey, Marine Corps is doing wargaming, doing wargaming. What has it done before? And are we sort of moving past the point that Marine Corps or wargaming got to in the Marine Corps previously? And if it did not succeed previously, why was that? And what are some thoughts about how it would do? So we wrote that article in 2021. We traced there was an ebb and flow of wargaming through the Marine Corps, really kind of going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And sort of our conclusion was, like, we've kind of been here before, especially within living memory of some sort of an older generation of Marines, like looking at the going into the 1980s and then sort of early to mid 1990s, kind of alongside the maneuver warfare debate, discussion about making that the Marine Corps' warfighting philosophy. There was a lot of wargaming going on, and so you had a lot of there were a lot of professional articles published in the Gazette about how to go do it. The Marine Corps pursued an actual, like, tabletop tactical wargaming system called TAC-WAR, which had 3 different sort of levels to represent, like, sort of lower level tactical and then larger formations up into operational. They bought a set for every infantry unit that was out there. Going into the mid 90s, as the personal computer revolution was starting to take off, you had it was under Commandant General Charles Krulak, Brew Krulak's son, by the way, at the Krulak Center, and he had sort of given the green light to putting commercial computer games on government computers to do more wargaming, and it was under his commandancy that there was a version of Doom, that the first person shooter Doom. It got a Marine modification for Marine Corps uniforms and equipment and stuff, so you could do like sort of rudimentary first person shooter, fire team on fire team tactics. And even getting into the early 2000s, there was a sponsored effort to have a Marine Corps version of the close combat computer game, which is a more sort of detailed tactical real-time tactics game. But as we and then it sort of petered out, and that was sort of the story of Marine Corps wargaming from the early 20th century onward. It would have these peaks and valleys. So our article, long way of saying, our article was like, we've kind of been here before. At the time we were writing, we were optimistic about the trajectory. As a matter of fact, late last year, we revisited that article for a couple of different podcasts, but like, okay, 2 years have gone by, where are we at? And again, I think, we agreed that the trajectory is definitely promising, because there has been an institutional investment in some areas of wargaming that did not previously exist. And once, kind of with anything in the military, once you've invested money in it, you sort of, you want to keep it going to get a payback on your investment, because it raises hard questions if you spend millions of dollars on something and nothing happens. So that's why we have, on the page you got there, you see like the Build a Wargaming Center near Marine Corps University. That is happening. The building's there, right? It's, I think they're sort of trying to finalize everything that's inside that building before opening it up. And I believe the target is later this year for that. At Marine Corps University, I saw the initial development of a computer-based wargaming cloud, where a number of commercial games were ported into the cloud. And the idea for the cloud was like, one of the sort of traditional challenges of wargaming is, or getting wargaming across the Marine Corps is both resourcing and access. And putting in a cloud-based environment gets after those two issues to the extent that it can. So, the cloud is bought and paid for already. And so for Marines around the world to use it, doesn't cost another dime, whether it's on an individual basis or a unit basis. And in terms of access, as long as you've got an internet connection, you can access the cloud from wherever you're at. So really, I think that's a unique resource, because it gets after some of the challenges of wargaming, especially educational gaming, which is, at Marine Corps University, you can put, you got all the school, like the resident students there, you can put games on the table in front of them relatively easily. Well, what about all the distant students who are actually they are the large majority of the annual PME population, students in the distance program? Okay, how do you, do you buy hundreds of copies of tabletop games and send it out to all those places and try and manage that? Well, you could, but it's just more challenging, just sort of by the distribution, the availability of instructors who know how to do it. The cloud helps solve that, because you can just, any distant student can plug into and access it. So those are some of the optimistic parts, and I'll stop there for your thoughts.
Yeah, well, there are some interesting parallels in other industries here too. Like, and I think a lot of some of this comes from, quite honestly, the pandemic, right? And our need to continue to train in what we do, or even be able to practice what we do. I'm in an IT industry, to maintain, how do we maintain training throughout that pandemic period? I think that this kind of went hand in hand with it. Is there anything about that? Were there any residual effects from that?
I mean, so maybe to an extent, I would say the plan. So the plan to develop a more robust educational wargaming capability, it started before the pandemic. Like I recall being in the rooms at MCU for the initial meetings where, basically it was Commandant said, we need more educational wargaming. bring all the brains who do wargaming together at the university as well as university leadership and try and figure out what that would look like. And before the pandemic, some sort of like common access digital system was something that was being talked about. The question was not like, was it a good idea? It was agreed it was a good idea. The question was, what games do you put in there? And then the pandemic, came out and really sort of drove home in a, it was sort of it was, I don't want to call it fate or fortune because there was nothing sort of lucky about it, but it just sort of drove home that there was incredible value in having that sort of that distance education access, because it turned out now your distance education's campuses, they couldn't even meet like together in a classroom somewhere on base anymore, right? They're already removed from the resident MCU. Now you're even more removed because your conference groups that are Miramar or Pendleton or Lejeune or whatever, they can't meet together now. Everybody's online, so it just got a whole lot harder. And so the cloud, Wargaming Cloud, was already in work, but it's the pandemic really highlighted the value of having that kind of resource.
Right, without diminishing. Let's look at the other side of the spectrum here. Without diminishing the power of the manual war game, right? As well, and you do still see PMEs strongly using manual wargaming. For example, force on force within the USMC, land power, and other. Like OWS and so forth. Like there's still proliferation, excuse me, of
Yeah,
strong
there's no
wargaming. Yeah, go ahead.
there's no one size fits all,
Right.
and I think that's a pretty agreed upon principle. Sebastian and I pointed it out in our article, but I also know, like, Tim Barrick, the wargaming director at MC, like, he's the equal opportunity wargamer. Many of us say that he's part of that crowd. Like, different games, whether they're digital or tabletop, get after different educational and training objectives, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's probably better than trying to make one giant game that does absolutely everything and then becomes unplayable. And in fact, for me and Sebastian, that was sort of our conclusion that we drew from the TAC War experiment the Marine Corps did, was that it eventually, like, it grew and grew because they wanted to make it more, I'm putting air quotes here, realistic in multiple elements, and eventually you do that, you make it unplayable. And that was sort of the fate of TAC War, is that it got so complex nobody wanted to play it and it just stayed on the shelf.
So what I thought was interesting, again, as an outsider, was that not only were you seeing some of this wargaming guidance from the commandant, etc., from within ranks, if you will, but also within the DoD at a higher level, right, at your state level. There was definitely a proliferation of guidance from even higher above at a strategic level at the worth and benefit of wargaming in general. This is a paper by Major Patrick O'Keefe. I don't know if you know Patrick.
I do not know.
I thought this was an interesting. This is I will give links to everything I'm showing, by the way, at the end on the YouTube video. But I thought this quote from the guidance was interesting. Curricula should leverage live, virtual, constructive, and gaming methodologies with war games and exercises involving multiple sets and repetitions. And I think that's a key phrase here, right? We must resource and develop a library of case studies, colloquia, games, and exercises. In having spoken to local ROTC programs in particular, right? I think this is my own personal opinion from outside, is that curricula, right, is kind of insular from what I'm seeing, is that the curriculum is a bit insular, right? You have a lot of different groups with a lot of different opinions about where things are and where they should go, and there doesn't necessarily appear to be kind of like more of a DoD aperture or scope guidance for curricula across the armed services, right? And you can even see a little bit of this in some of the defense analysis by GAO which is guidance that was given to the Congress, House of Representatives, and so forth. In which case, I like how they summarized here. The GAO, not GI Joe, GAO found that there are barriers to accessing war game data. I thought this was very interesting, very poignant. Barriers to accessing war game data, information on upcoming war games is not shared, and the services have not developed standard education and qualifications for war gamers, which is I thought was pretty poignant and interesting. Any thoughts on this study here? Those particular
Yeah.
points.
So that final point there, I'll circle back to it here in a minute. But to the, I guess starting back with the curricula, right? That
Right.
Andrew O'Keefe talks about. Uh, I came and I also should have sort of said this at the outset here. You just kind of remind me there for a second. Like, yeah, this is my personal opinion, and mine alone. From I am now on the outside looking in, as well. Didn't used to be the case, but now that's where I am. So these are just my thoughts. They're not representative. They're certainly not the Marine Corps thoughts because I don't wear the uniform anymore, and they're not the thoughts of any organizations with which I'm affiliated. But anyway, so going to in my time at MCU, I got a new, I got a new appreciation for, in a larger sense, the challenges of how you modify curricula when somebody comes along and says, "I want more of X." Um, Now, there is certainly institutional inertia present in any large institution when some new leader comes along and says, "I want you to change what you're doing and do it fast," right? Um, Especially if you know that leader is going to be sort of potentially moving on from that leadership position before his or her changes have had a chance to really take root, and then they're gone. Next leader comes in, you're like, they want Y now. Last guy wanted X. This guy wants Y. Well, what do you keep slingshotting your curriculum back and forth based on that? So there's often a
Ebb and
reluctance to
flow.
start, yeah, an ebb
Right.
and flow, and a reluctance to make major changes when developing a curriculum that meets your required educational or training outputs is hard work, and it takes a lot of time. Like, it takes a lot of time to get sort of all the different entities who are going to be doing the instruction or the training to agree that this is what the curriculum should look like. This is what's important. This is how many hours should go into it. And once you have that set, like, that's a lot of work to go into that, and you get reluctant to change that, right? And that's not a value judgment. It's not good or bad or anything. It's just it. I think from sort of a human perspective, you can understand, like, if I put a lot of work into something, I'd like to do that thing, right, and then not have to do it all over again based on guidance that changes every few years. And sort of but with that, like, so if the boss comes and says, "I want you to do X," well, you kind of need to do that, no matter how much you may not want to. And then the question becomes, okay, if I'm going to put X in, what am I taking out? And that generates a whole new sort of discussion and analysis of the curriculum. Because if you think that you built the best possible curriculum to meet your mandated training or educational objectives, and you've devoted certain numbers of hours to all these things, and then somebody comes and says, "Well, I want 20 hours of wargaming," right? All right. Well, what 20 hours are you cutting out? From where? Um, what 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 do you have to reduce in priority to get after this new priority? And I developed a lot of sympathy, for that, because as at the Krulak Center, as we're trying to help schools do wargaming, and then but we're not involved in the curriculum development process at all, which is a very intensive process. And if somebody came to the Krulak Center and said, "I want you to start doing more of this," we'd be in the same boat. Like, all right, well, that means we need to stop doing other things. How do we decide what falls off? What falls off the board there?
Absolutely. And
But
I mean, the reason just personal, again, my own opinion from the outside, is that I felt like some of this may be better suited, if not, I won't say best suited, in more of a fight club approach, right? Where individuals are given the given the materials and knowledge and comfort of wargaming, and then they effectively kind of can use their own time to do these things. So there is a divide there, right? Anything that you has to in effect be the equivalent of a hobby, right, pulls it away from the day to day, the routine, right, the training, the exercise, right.
Yeah,
So
and so I thought like that was something that Damien really got into in his article, which was, um, oh, you build a fight club, who shows up, and it turns out that
right.
participation is sort of fairly limited to a key audience who was probably really into it already, and is willing to take the extra time. Um, so this all kind of wraps together, and so like how do you get it into the formal curricula first of all, like in a way that doesn't piss everybody off. One way to do that is see what they're already doing and see if you can do what they're doing with a war game rather than some sort of other exercise or class, right? And that's a way to start establishing the habit pattern of wargaming without causing more disruption than necessary to the established curriculum. But sort of outside of that, so like something me and so Damien sort of I think touches on it, and then when Sebastian and I did our podcast for the Kulak Center on our article, kind of looking back, we at one point I made there, and I'll repeat it here, is like we had like a half dozen lessons from history, like how do you get wargaming to stick, right? But one of the things that was not on that list, but that I spoke about at the end of our interview was like, if the institution does not formally incentivize and formally, you know, evaluate your energy and your success or failure in doing this, then all of the other lessons from history and all the other, sort of, good faith individual efforts and Fight Club, all that stuff are going to have a really hard time gaining traction because as with like the levels of participation with the MCU Fight Club, as Damien noted in his article, the use of wargaming around the Fleet Marine Force is it's very uneven and often personality driven by people who just think that it's worth doing even if they're not getting evaluated or graded on it. Like if you don't have um, something that is sort of I don't want to say mandating you, but protecting your investment in it by
Hmm.
giving it official backing, like you're going to have a really hard time making it stick. And that's kind of the
Where
I sorry, go ahead.
where would you like to see? How does this fit in? I think there's an issue of scope, right? There's an issue of a little bit of an issue of scope, and in not only the wargaming itself and the actual design of the war game. I've heard some arguments in the debate of that this rank doesn't really need to know that, and they really probably shouldn't necessarily be concentrating on that scope of decision making, right? So, is there still though something to say for preps and reps at any scope, any scaling level? Like, in other words, if I'm a lieutenant, I mean, should I be necessarily wargaming at a strategic level? I personally, again, my own opinion from the outside, feel like no matter, I feel like you gain a much wider brain cell set just from looking at the problem, the dilemma at each scale, at each scope level, right? And you gain benefits, right, from wargaming at any scale and scope. What are your thoughts on that? And how does that actually, again, looking at each level, looking at like officer candidacy and ROTC versus the day to day and while you're deployed at each echelon level, how does wargaming scope in the field?
Yeah, so that is one of the key questions, and it's something that I think I've talked about with Sebastian and some others in the field. But one thing that helps with the scope that does not exist right now is a continuum of wargaming that you would have touch points with along your entire professional career. And that goes to the ROTC point from the moment you step in the door. And so I recall sketching out on whiteboards somewhere. It might have been at MCU, but like as you have a training continuum in your specialty in the military service, right? Like if you're a Marine, you start off with basic infantry tactical skills at TBS, and then you go to your MOS school, and your training continuum is always ramping up, right? Always, first it lays the foundation, and then it builds up to more complex tasks, interacting with more pieces, and that process never stops so long as you are in uniform. Like there is, um, even in like flight designations, right? Like I'm a former aviator. There are like sort of peak designations. It takes a long time to get there, but then also as you get promoted, you have your designations, but as you get promoted, now your level of responsibility within the squadron gets higher, and now you have to have a new perspective on what your flight designations and how it applies to higher levels of responsibility. So we already train, like we do training to that scale. Similar with professional military education, like you start very basic in the basic school, and then when you're a captain, you do EWS, which gets you go start thinking from the tactical slightly into the operational to you know you're getting away from the platoon into like, okay, how does a battalion do stuff, right? Then when you're a major, right, you're expanding that aperture more into the operational. And now I'm talking about multiple maneuver elements, and again, that never stops. There's no wargaming equivalent to that, and so
Right.
I think,
I think there's not necessarily right an existing war game system even that on its own can scale at that degree, right?
yeah.
Go ahead.
So but yeah, there is not, and that's why I think as sort of put the stake in the sand at MCU, right? Like, and with the Neller Wargaming Center, which is more analytical, not educational, but we can go to separate roads later if we want to. But yeah, the point is, like, there's no established, like, okay, what game would we use for that? I think that is a key decision that if the Marine Corps wants to make it stick, it's got to decide, okay, what games are going to be part of that continuum? What are the games that you give to your ROTC, midshipmen? What are the games you give to your entry level enlisted Marines? But then it needs to be something that as you give them multiple touch points with that game,
Right.
that's what their touch point is through the first block of their career. Then as they get more senior, you look at a different game that you have multiple touch points with.
Right, but you could end up with hallucinations from that, right? I mean, because somebody gets, and again, these are, let's classify a majority are non-war gamers, right? Historically, right? And then, so how do you not confuse them over time, right? You have this one game that's very much designed for this thing. You have this other game that's very much designed in this way, in this approach, and this mechanism, and card mechanisms, and blah blah blah, hexes, and blah blah blah. We can argue whichever way. But so if you don't have like a modular system that any echelon can in effect click back into scoping wise, right? There's no consistency in that education, right? Potentially.
Yeah, which is like deciding what games are going to be in that continuum is
Yeah, right.
that, I mean, that's arguably like a service level decision. That's something
Yeah,
that you know an entity like Training and Education Command, ideally with good input, um, would be able to develop and publish. But I want to take that and then go back to it gets to kind of a second challenge, which is what that in that GAO report, that red highlighted piece you had, which is there is no sort of pipeline to develop future war gamers. And this is something that I know. I talk with folks at work where I work about this. I talk with Sebastian about it. This is a separate but related challenge because even if you have a solid continuum of games, um, somebody needs to help, sort of, we call it train the trainer, teach the teacher, and there's no war game qualification like course or school that you can go to to get that training and then like go back to your unit. And I'm going to use an aviation analogy here, right? Because it's what I know. But um, in the marine aviation, you have your weapons and tactics instructor. They are that's like they get that's all the flight designations, all the instructor designations. They go to a very intense school at MOTS One out in Yuma, right? For where is it, 6 weeks to 2 months? I'm not 100% sure, but it's a long training school. A lot of resources get put into it, but the whole point of it is like is to it's not like MOTS One goes around the entire aviation force of the Marine Corps and it's the MOTS One staff who do all the advanced level training. They build the weapons and tactics instructors there, and then they go back to their units. So every squadron has at least one WTI, usually more, I believe, just to make sure there's some roster depth there. But they go back and they teach the unit, these more advanced tactical things. And MOTS One maintains this, helps maintain the training standards, but it's the WTIs who do it, right? And it's through that formal pipeline at the WTI course. Well, there is no equivalent pipeline that how do you develop a war gamer, a professional military war gamer, and then having developed them, then you can send them back, and then they can help their units help themselves, rather than having like some distant remote repository that the units don't have direct access to. Um, and this is not just a Marine Corps thing. Like this, there no such pipeline exists in the military. And there are some organizations out there that can provide some wargaming training, like the Military Operations Research Society. They offer a number of wargaming courses that are actually accredited through Virginia Polytechnic Institute, I believe it is. And then U.S. Army has a couple of courses I've attended where they do like kind of a wargaming 101. I attended that one. Um, they have one at a more advanced one at the Army War College. Uh, but these are sort of uh, they're efforts that are somewhat less sort of limited to certain specific locations and to very small numbers of people. There's no training pipeline for how to build war gamers who can then go back and to your point, like to make the training of those unit, using those war games, make it a more valuable use of time. That simply doesn't exist. And so I'd say, like, aside from having a continuum of games, you need somebody there at each unit who understands how to use them, how to achieve the training education objectives that you want out of those games. And as it stands, there's no pipeline in the DoD that does that.
And hold on a second. And to gratuitously self quote, um, I have issues getting war gamers to war game, let alone non war gamers. Um, I mean, literally, sincerely, right? Locally, people who have played decades understand wargaming, love wargaming. It's still just very difficult to get anybody to do anything, honestly. But wargaming in particular, I mean, so in other words, just trying to not to make light of the subject, but it is an issue, right? It is getting people of like mind in the same room with the same goals, and they even have the same definition of what they're what a war game is and where it can be played, where it should be played. There are a lot of different scoping and scaling issues, just in particular around strategizing, like force design. Strategizing on force design, for example, is a different goal or end state than having individuals, ROTC, at any echelon exercising their brain in decision making and planning, right? I think we had a slight side discussion about this as to where does this fit in with course of action analysis. How is this potentially a part of op order and planning, and how is it different potentially?
Yeah, well, first off, I'll say, in truth in advertising, I've not been to like sort of the advanced planners schools that the different services have, where they get really deep into how to effectively use the different steps of the planning process to develop what it is your unit's going to do operationally. I've had some exposure to the Marine Corps planning process because that's part of our normal PME. But the planners who do the more detailed plans, I just haven't been to those schools. That said, my personal thought is like the COA war game analysis. It's a different beast than what you're trying to get after with educational wargaming as a professional development tool, which is also a different beast than the use of analytical wargaming. To really drill down on operational plans, or future capabilities, and potentially generate some data and insights that's going to drive modifications to a plan, that's going to drive acquisition, stuff like that. Um, I, I I think they're different. I think they're different beasts. And as I think the O'Keefe article, it kind of talks about the use of our commercial type war games as a tool for that war game process. Sorry, war game step in the co-development process. And I think that's fine. But that's not the that's not the only place that I think wargaming needs to go. And I want to say the O'Keefe article would sort of agree with me on that as well. But to like my perspective is like the you use a war game, like an actual commercial or a specially developed war game for co-development. That's fine for the staff planning process, and sure, that helps the staff who's working on the plan for this commanding officer maybe make a better plan, right? Gives better options to the commander for them to decide what it is their unit's gonna do. But that's not developing the decision making skills of like the bulk of the people in your unit, right? That's a very small decision making process for a small number of people on that staff. It doesn't help your fire team leaders or your squad leaders or your platoon leaders develop their own decision making skills in that at all. So I'd say you need, there's multiple uses of wargaming inside a unit. COA wargaming is only one of those, and arguably, again, personal opinion, like I tend to like to want to
It's
do
it's
to do more
plan
for more.
it's planning versus decision making, really. I mean, obviously they go hand in hand to a certain degree, right? It's definitely planning versus decision making is what I'm kind of hearing from you. And we have in existence TDGs, tactical decision games. So I mean, how do you see the relationship between kind of like the existing TDGs that the Marine Corps Gazette puts out, and many other publications do as well, and COTS wargaming and/or internally developed wargaming?
I I think they're all different tools that can be applied to the core goal of improving the thought processes and decision making skills of the people in your unit. And if I had my choices, you would be doing all of the above as frequently as possible, because no one of those tools by themselves is going to make you the perfect decision maker or the perfect leader. You need different tools help you do different things, and as well, like the to and to include the amount of time you have to do those, right? Like you could do a TDG in a few minutes. And you could find a few minutes during a day anywhere to go do that, right? Doing a tabletop war game might take you a couple hours, something that you need to plan to a little bit more, but then you're also, again, going back to my aviation background, like where you do your training and your learning, you go to the simulator to do stuff, right? Where you can get your hands on the controls, and so it's that crawl, walk, run idea where you learn in the simulated environment where you can get the basic mistakes out of the way, and then when you go fly the mission for real, like you're not wasting time and fuel
Yeah,
making
I
those
mean,
same mistakes, right? You can make new mistakes, and flying in the real aircraft is always different than flying in the simulator, but it's all part of your is developing your skills, um, and you should do all of them,
and then
because each one.
and then one of the keys. This is also in Moore's article. This is kind of near his summary, which is very good. Wargaming should not. A couple key points here. Wargaming should not be limited to PME. That's a topic unto itself. Um, Training opportunities against fully invested, free thinking enemies as well. And I think that's sometimes, a TDG is in effect kind of a one-sided, a one-sided argument, right? You're free thinking against a scenario, right? So I think where you gain from wargaming, quotation marks, is the fact that you're, again, using a free thinking enemy as well, red teaming and so forth.
Yeah, and this is actually kind of a soapbox that I've stood on in other places, but like when we think in as military professionals, I say we royal we, right? Like I'm not in uniform again. I'm just reverting back to my form, from the last 20 years. But like, the military professional, we pride ourselves on, making, fast lightning decisions in the heat of action, right? We're decisive. We make choices more quickly than our adversary, who's trying to, undermine our choices and stuff. Like the the decision maker on the battlefield is like is the the archetype that we aim for. However, day to day, right? Like the I again, personal opinion, almost none of the training or education you do day to day in a unit is against that free thinking enemy. Um, it's usually a one sided effort, that's still important. Like back to that crawl walk run, right? Like if I'm in the aircraft, first I'm gonna study the tactical manual for like the things we're gonna do on an upcoming training flight. I might go to the simulator, fly through to sort of get a feel for how those tactics, um, interact with the aircraft, and then we go fly the flight, and see how the tactics, do with all the, the uncertainty of the aircraft breaking down or weather, not being what you wanted, right? But there's no enemy that's like at the end of that you're trying to succeed against. I arguably there are a handful of exercises where that is actually true. Right, I'm talking about the MOTS one course for the weapons and tactics instructors. That's one example. The MAGTF warfighting exercises at 29 Palms. Well, large scale unit exercises. There is a thinking adversary out there, but those are
But you don't get the
certain. Those
reps, right? You
Yeah,
don't get
those are specific events that only happen infrequently, and in the case of WTI, that's only for a small select group of people, right? Where do the rest of your Marines get that opportunity? And in the day-to-day life of your unit, they're not, right? Like this idea, we pride ourselves on being those decisive
so
decision makers. We don't make decisions against a thinking enemy
so
on a day-to-day basis.
so gauntlet on the floor. What does that look like? What is that end state? What does better look like for that on the day to day? In a perfect world, where do we gain that time without losing the existing training and duty, and and just the existing day? There are the existing day to day routines for a reason, of course, right? To instill very specific skills in a timely manner, you know, duty and obeying orders, etc. The single mindset. So how do we on a day to day basis allow for the freedom of the individual thought versus the necessity of duty, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a couple ways, and I'm not saying that they're like easy or fast to achieve, but another part of my soapbox is some sort of larger critiques I've had about the um, kind of the manpower system, and it goes back to like kind of a bumper sticker I like to throw out, which is what we evaluate is what we value. All right, and that drives a lot. That drives almost everything in your unit's day to day, as well as your personal individual day to day. What am I being evaluated on? What is higher looking at, right? And hey, it turns out actually making decisions against a thinking enemy is not it's not an evaluable
Hmm.
metric,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not on the individual fitness report of the Marine. It's not on it's not on a unit's list of it's not in the sorry, it's not in the training and readiness manual for individual units. It's not like on the stoplight charts of readiness that goes to higher. Like that's not a metric that is evaluated. And so if you believe, institutionally, if you believe that you want your Marines to be good decision makers, if you want them to succeed against a thinking human enemy, you need to evaluate that. Because if you don't actually value the bumper sticker of elite decision makers.
So they
Um,
think, just listening to that statement, first of all, very well stated. Um, my immediate reaction is then testing of that. What is the metric? What is the grading of that? What does that look like for you? What is the metric?
well, yeah. So I again, I want to kind of, I, as much as I like to give aviation crap, like for thinking they're the center of the universe when they're not, they're supposed to be. They're support the ground guys. I personally think that the model of the weapons and tactics instructors and the school that manages them out at MOTS One is a potential model to follow for that. And in fact, I made the same point. I don't know, like 8 or 9 years ago, um, when I attended a workshop where this General Neller had taken over as commandant. He was talking about reinvigorating a maneuver warfare mindset across the Marine Corps. And so I went to this workshop and we were talking about like, okay, well, how do you evaluate the maneuverism, the
Maneuverability.
maneuver warfareness of a unit, right? Like how do you do that? And I was like, if again looking at the aviation model, like MOTS One holds the state, they help develop the standards, right? And then they train the standard bearers, if you will, and the weapons and tactics instructor. And then the weapons and tactics instructors go back and teach that standard to the units. And then, MOTS One still has um, they maintain oversight and sort of final responsibility for for making sure those WTIs at the units are meeting that standard, because for certain advanced designations back at the unit, they will pull in like a MOTS One instructor from MEMA to do those more advanced level stuff to make sure that the work that the WTIs have done, out of sight over the horizon, to make sure that the when the WTI at the squadron says this person's ready for this check flight for this thing, right? They bring in a MOTS One instructor to do that final flight to make sure that no kidding they fly that flight to the standard that MOTS One develops. And so whether I don't know if we're ever going to go back to the whole reinvigorating maneuver warfare. Let's get a maneuver warfare tactics and instructor school. But if we're looking at evaluating that in the wargaming context, I think that is a potential model to use. Somebody has, and that helps with it helps with like what war game do I use, right? Well, the school will establish that's the standard.
Hmm.
They train, sort of the evangelists, if you will, and the instructors that go to the units, teach the units how to do it, can run the units through the game multiple times. And then for those sort of higher final evaluations, you send somebody from the schoolhouse to make sure that, yeah, no kidding, they met that standard as an independent evaluation. And because it's evaluated, right, it's a something that is graded against a standard that is that helps you have a little bit more uniformity across the fleet, right, in terms of the standard that's being used.
Hmm.
But it also, like, you gotta build the infrastructure. You got to plug the infrastructure into the institution um, to make sure that the words you're saying are not just more than a bumper sticker, that they are evaluated and enforced.
Hmm.
I think until you do that, then uh, and the nice sorry, like the thing about having a school, right? Like the school is essentially like the top down enforcement of what they want the subordinate units to do, at least in the case of aviation, right? Like MOTS One is a service level school, so it's from the it's got top down authority to enforce service level standards in aviation. You have you have a school that does that, and they have the authorities to develop the standards and grade against it. That is a way to affect the day-to-day
All right.
life of that unit,
And
because that's what the WTI instructors do.
and tangentially, any form of wargaming at any scope, at any scale, exercises the muscles involved in that metric, and the brain muscles involved in that grading, while I really like how you congealed that into a viable metric, right? But
Yeah,
there's
and
yeah,
sorry, and one more thing, if I could.
yep,
So that's maybe that gets you on the like the day to day, like when I show up to work kind of thing. Another possible arm though is every unit is supposed to have a education officer for that unit because the state of the unit's education program is a gradable item on the commanding general's inspection checklist that usually happens every couple of years, I want to say, at a unit. I got to tell you, like maybe the ground standards for education officers are different on their checklist, but the on the aviation commanding general's inspection checklist for the education officer, there's like two bullets, and one of them is you've got a binder that of websites that you can point a Marine to when they're talking about professional development. Like that education officer does very little on the day-to-day basis. That
hmm
could be that could be another metric, and you don't even have to like make a new make a new job since somebody is already tapped as the education officer. But maybe if you added some more items to that checklist for, oh, is the education officer, hey, are they running a war game from the wargaming continuum that's been developed by the higher schoolhouse? Like, are they running that for the unit? How often are they running it for? What's the level of participation? And
do you,
again, to be a value, what we evaluate. That's a way of impacting maybe not the day to day, but professional development is sometimes an outside of the office type thing, right?
do,
Well, that's still something you can check if you really wanted to
hmm.
make it checkable.
Do you feel that there is an equivalent in all of the armed services? I mean,
Uh,
obviously these services have to solve this problem unto themselves, but do you feel like there's at least a general peer of that educational officer in across the board in all armed services?
I don't have nearly enough exposure to
All right.
know if that's the case. I just
Okay.
know the
Yep.
Marine Corps.
Lead by example. There we go. So problem solved, right, Ian? We're done, right? Problem solved.
Well, I mean, it's yeah, you gotta want to solve it.
Well, yeah, sure. I think everybody. I think fundamentally everybody sees the worth of war games. It's just trying to convince however many people of the single solution. As in any industry with any problem, right? How do you convince everyone to follow the same metric, to follow suit, right? I think we
Yeah, well,
all. Yeah. Go ahead.
the nice thing about the military is you don't necessarily always have to convince, you can command. And that is having that command directive ability um, means that you now have to do certain things that maybe you're not personally interested in. But if you are evaluated against it, you better develop an interest in it because if you don't have that interest, your evaluation will reflect, and we will help you find another employment, and we will
So,
instead advance the people who do put an interest into the things that they are commanded to be interested in.
so I like to end my conversations by throwing a wrench for future thought, right? So I think everybody here should go back and read the 38th Commandant's Planning Guide. It's extremely well thought out. Now, one thing about that is there's 3 pages worth of information on wargaming.
Yep.
Is the current Commandant Gauntlet Throne focusing at an equal level as the prior on wargaming? Because if I read now, again, there might be a timing thing involved here as far as when planning guidance gets published or brought together. But are we seeing, particular to the current commandant, the same level of attention to wargaming
Well,
without getting too
it,
critical?
actually, it's a relatively, I think, a straightforward answer. I don't know yet because, as you're probably aware, he had some pretty serious health problems shortly after he took after,
hmm
which has really thrown a wrench in him being able to get his guidance out to the fleet. And so you've had, I think the
Initial
AdMac has
guidance, yeah.
Yeah, so he has not issued his, and I think he got some white papers out initially, and then he had the health issue, and has not. There's been no, General Smith's Commandant's planning guidance is not out yet. So
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know. It's the simple
yeah,
answer.
yeah.
But I'll say I had some interaction with General Smith when I was still at the Krulak Center, and from everything I know is that he fully intends to continue the transitions and reforms that were first laid out by General Berger under Force Design 2030. Where General Smith's areas of emphasis will be could be different, and in fact, I think in some respects, he's shown that he has some different areas of emphasis. I know that quality of life was something he highlighted before he had his health problems, but it's something that the Marine Corps is doing kind of like a about a stern assessment of. I don't know if you saw on LinkedIn recently, but Marine Corps announced it's going to be doing a across the board inspection of barracks for their condition and the quality of life that's there, because there have been so many issues with the barracks, right? So it seems to me that quality of life is definitely on the front burner for General Smith, and sort of once he's back in the full fight and issues his planning guidance, we'll see where those other areas of emphasis are. But I don't think he's going to be. I think he's going to, like I said, continue the transitions under Force Design 2030. At the lower echelons, like I said, the Neller Center is still going to open this year. MCU is still, ramping up the scale and the quality of the wargaming cloud. And they hired Tim Barrick as the wargaming director, and he's actively, that staff is being expanded. So that's sort of, to me, that says, we're continuing to invest, and we want to expand the things that are being offered under that. But the short answer is I just don't know, because General Smith hasn't published his planning guidance, because he, you know, the fates had a different sort of threw a wrench in his works at the very beginning.
So on that note, first of all, again, all the everything we've stated are our own opinions, and take them as such. Um, I think I think we can all agree that wargaming is important, and should be shared, and there should be a level of comfort in it. And I think that's one of the keys from my vantage point, is just to get to at any echelon establish a comfort level in practicing decision making. And I'll end on that emphasis from the 38th Commandant's Planning Guide there, that our greatest deficiency is training and education of leaders, practice and decision making against a thinking enemy. And any form that takes, I think, is beneficial. And I
Yeah,
think we can all at least agree on that. So,
yeah,
uh, so thank you very much, Ian, for taking the time out of your Saturday morning to have this conversation. And I think it's a conversation that needs to continue. I think that each armed service will have their own needs and priorities around this, of course. But I think it's still important and will remain in importance. So, cool. Thank you very much, Ian.
yeah. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity, and I agree it does need to continue, and I really want it to, because as the historical review Sebastian and I did, like, it's ebbed and flowed, and I would hate to see it ebb again, because I do think that we are heads and shoulders above where we were the last time the Marine Corps went through this, and I want to see it continue and grow.
Awesome. Thank you again. Have a good day,
Yeah,
everybody.
thanks, you too.